Feral by Night is a storytelling series of eerie tales, strange houses, hauntings, weird things that happen on lonely roads, and all the things that go bump in the night. I'm Papa G, and this is Feral by Night. So turn the lights down and settle in. Some stories are better heard after dark. Iris had never set foot in that house before, but the portrait above the parlor fireplace already knew her face. She stopped at the edge of the room so suddenly that Ben nearly walked into her, and when his hand touched her shoulder, she barely felt it. The rest of the tour group drifted past them into the parlor, speaking in low voices while the guide waited beside a rosewood table near the windows. They were in New Orleans for their 10th anniversary, staying in a small hotel with green shutters and a courtyard where ferns grew out of cracked brick planters. Iris had booked the historic house tour because the afternoon was too hot for the cemetery walk they'd planned, and because Ben liked old houses. He liked carved staircases, original plaster, and the kind of door hinges that looked heavy enough to survive a war. The guide had described the house as an 1840s residence built by the Vellard family, then later converted into a museum after passing through several owners. Most of the furniture, she explained, had belonged either to the house itself or to families connected with it. The rooms held marble fireplaces, dark French mirrors, and wallpaper with faded vines crawling up towards ceilings that seemed too high for any modern life. Iris had enjoyed the tour until the parlor. The portrait hung above a black marble fireplace at the far end of the room, framed in old gold and set beneath a mantel crowded with porcelain figures. The woman in it wore a dark green dress and sat with one hand resting on the arm of a carved chair. Her hair was parted in the middle and pinned low at the back of her neck, but the face was Iris's. The same long nose, the same deep-set brown eyes, the same narrow mouth that always looked more serious in photographs than she meant it to. Then Iris saw the scar through the painted woman's left eyebrow, and her stomach went cold. Ben leaned closer and asked quietly if she was all right. Iris said the portrait looked like her, though that wasn't strong enough for what she meant. Ben followed her gaze, and the little breath he took told her he saw it too. He tried to say that people had doubles and old portraits could play tricks in dim rooms, but his voice didn't have any weight behind it. The guide began talking about the parlor as if nothing unusual had happened. She explained that the room had been used for receiving guests, and that the mirror between the windows was original to the house. When she mentioned the portrait, she kept her eyes on the group instead of the painting. She said the woman was believed to be one of the later Vellard wives, though the records had gaps from yellow fever, family disputes, and missing parish documents. Iris barely heard the rest because she was looking at the painted woman's left hand. The woman wore a plain gold wedding band, just as Iris did. In the portrait, the gold ring had a thin, dark line through it, like a crack in old enamel. Iris looked down at her own hand. Her ring was smooth, warm from her skin, and tight from the humid weather. Ben lifted his phone and tried to take a picture. He held it up toward the fireplace, then lowered it without pressing the button. His face had changed, and when Iris asked what was wrong, he raised the phone again so she could see the screen. The camera showed the fireplace, the black marble, the gold frame, and the painted chair. It showed the woman's green dress and folded hand, but the face inside the portrait had blurred into a pale, unfinished smear. Ben took the photo anyway. When he opened it, the face was clear. It was Iris. The guide stopped speaking for half a second, such a small pause that most of the tour group missed it. But Iris saw the woman's eyes flick to the phone, then to the portrait, then away. After that, the guide moved the group toward the mirror and began explaining the cloudy silvering on the glass. The parlor mirror stood between the tall front windows. Its surface had dark spots near the edges, and the room inside it looked older than the room around them. The afternoon light was weaker in the reflection. The chandelier seemed lower. The wallpaper looked fresh and green instead of faded brown. Iris stepped closer before she meant to, and in the mirror, she was wearing the green dress. She jerked back so hard that Ben caught her by the elbow. In the actual room, she was still in her white sundress and sandals. Her silver pendant still rested at the base of her throat. Her hair was still loose from the heat. But in the mirror, the woman in green stood near the mantel with Iris's face and Iris's scar. Behind the reflected Iris stood a man in a dark coat. His face wouldn't hold still in the glass. Each time Iris tried to focus on it, the features seemed to soften and slide, like wet paint touched before it had dried. His hand hovered near her shoulder, close enough to claim her without touching her. Ben moved between Iris and the mirror. For a moment, the reflection corrected itself, and he appeared there exactly as he was, damp-haired from the weather, wearing a blue linen shirt and khaki shorts, frightened enough now that he had stopped pretending. Then the mirror changed again. It showed Ben standing alone. Iris was beside him in the room, close enough to feel his arm against hers, but in the mirror she was gone. The air in the parlor thickened. Street noise faded behind the windows, and the voices of the tour group sank into a muffled hush that felt farther away than it should have. The other visitors still stood near the guide, but their movements had slowed in a strange way. A woman lifted her hand toward her necklace and held it there too long. A man turned his head toward the fireplace and stayed half-turned. The guide's mouth moved, though no sound reached Iris. Ben told Iris they were leaving. He led her toward the parlor doors, but the doorway seemed farther away than it had been. The parlor stretched around them without changing size, as if every step forward moved the hall back by the same amount. The marble fireplace stayed at their left. The mirror stayed at their right. The portrait watched from above the mantel. Iris felt a sharp pinch around her ring finger. She looked down and saw a dark line running through her wedding band. It matched the crack in the portrait. The gold had split so cleanly that it looked cut by a jeweler's tool. But the band still held tight around her finger. Ben saw it and tried to work the ring loose. It wouldn't move. The more he pulled, the colder the metal became. Iris felt the chill climb into her hand and up her arm, as though the ring had found a vein. The guide's voice returned from across the room, but it sounded distant, like it was coming through a wall. She told the group that the Vellard women were often painted after marriage, usually in the front parlor, where guests could see the family's good fortune displayed above the hearth. She said some of the portraits had been moved or lost over the years. Then she turned her head slightly toward Iris, and her voice dropped lower. She said the house remembered its wives better than the family did. Ben pulled Iris harder toward the hall. The parlor doors finally stood close enough to touch. He grabbed one handle and opened it, but the room beyond wasn't the front hall. It was the parlor again. The same fireplace waited across from them. The same portrait hung above it. The same tour group stood by the mirror with their faces turned slightly away. Ben shut the door and opened it again, only to find the parlor waiting a second time, quiet and expectant. Iris turned back toward the fireplace. The portrait had changed. The woman in green was standing now, one hand resting against the carved chair. Her painted head was turned toward the doorway. The scar through her left eyebrow had darkened, and the cracked ring on her finger gleamed with a thin line of wet red. Iris touched her own eyebrow and felt blood. Ben saw it and went pale. He took out his phone again, this time with shaking hands, and tried to call emergency services. The screen showed one bar, then none, then a date Iris didn't recognize. August 14th, 1849. The numbers sat at the top of the screen for 3 seconds before his phone shut off in his palm. The room shifted without sound. The electric lights were gone. Candlelight flickered in the mirror. The tour group had faded into dark shapes near the windows. The guide stood clearer than the others, but her cream linen jacket now looked like an old-fashioned bodice, and her face had the flattened, watchful stillness of someone used to keeping a house's secrets. Iris smelled wax, old roses, river damp, and fireplace ash. On the rosewood table, a large guest ledger lay open, though it hadn't been there before. The pages were yellow, the ink brown. Iris saw rows of names written in careful script. She didn't want to go near it, but her feet carried her forward while Ben tried to hold her back. Her name was on the page, Mrs. Iris Vellard. The ink was still wet. Ben's hand tightened around her wrist. He told her to look at him, to keep looking at him, to stay with him. Iris tried. She fixed her eyes on his face, on the sweat at his temple and the fear in his mouth. For a moment, the parlor steadied around them. Then the portrait above the fireplace became empty, and the painted chair sat alone. The guide closed the ledger with both hands. Iris felt the room take hold of her. It wasn't a hand around her arm or a push against her back. It was colder and stranger than that, a pulling from every direction at once. The mirror brightened. The fireplace darkened. Ben's face stretched away from her as if he were standing at the far end of a long hall. He still held her wrist, then he didn't. The parlor snapped back into afternoon. The tour group was moving again. The guide was speaking in her pleasant museum voice about imported marble and French mirrors. A car horn sounded outside. Someone laughed softly near the windows. Ben stood alone beside the rosewood table. Iris was gone. For a few seconds, he turned in place, searching the corners of the room as though she might have stepped behind a curtain or into a shadow. Then he ran to the parlor doors and threw them open. This time, the front hall was there, bright and ordinary. He shouted for help, though the sound came out ragged and raw. The guide looked confused at first. Then she looked toward the fireplace and her expression went carefully blank. Police came before evening. They searched every room the museum would allow them to enter. They opened closets, checked behind screens, walked the courtyard, and questioned the staff. Ben showed them the picture on his phone, the one he had taken of the portrait when Iris was still beside him. But the photo had changed. It showed the parlor fireplace and the woman in green sitting above it. Her face was clear. Her hands were folded. The cracked ring shone on her finger. At the bottom of the frame, a brass nameplate had appeared. Mrs. Iris Vellard, 1849. Ben kept saying that nameplate hadn't been there before. He kept saying Iris had walked into the house wearing a white sundress, carrying a straw purse, with their hotel key card tucked into the inside pocket. The officers listened with the kind of patience that made everything worse. Before he left, Ben turned back once from the front hall. The portrait was different again. Iris was still seated in the carved chair, but her eyes had moved. They were looking past the room, past the guide, past the visitors and police, straight toward Ben. Her left hand rested on the chair arm, and the cracked wedding ring had closed into a smooth gold band. Only one thing in the painting had changed from life. Behind Iris, in the cloudy parlor mirror, Ben's reflection stood beside the fireplace in his blue shirt and khaki shorts. His painted face was unfinished around the eyes, and one pale hand rested on the back of Iris's chair, waiting for the house to remember the rest of him. Feral by Night is the sister podcast to The Feral Folklorist. You can find information on both podcasts on feralfolklorist.com. And if you'd like to see the animated video versions of these stories, consider becoming a patron on my Patreon at patreon.com/PapaG. And if you're ever in the market for metaphysical supplies, our store, Aromagees Botanica, has been weaving magic for over 25 years. That's over at aromagees.com.